Earlier this month, I was driving to church, and I had the radio on, and something was said on the radio that at first I thought to myself, that can't be true. And then I did some research when I got to the office here, and I found out that what the person on the radio was saying was, in fact, true. In the first quarter of this year, the average new car loan that was written has a monthly payment of $648 a month for 72 months. The average amount borrowed is $39,540. And 12.5% of all car loans written in the first quarter of this year have a monthly payment due more than $1,000 per month. Those numbers shocked me. Like I said, I didn't think at first they could be true. My first house payment wasn't $648 a month. You know, for a lot of families and even older individuals who are living on a fixed income, there never seems to be quite enough paycheck at the end of the month. And of course, over the past couple of years, as inflation has soared to record levels not seen since the Carter administration in the late 70s, and with gas prices as high as they've been since 2008, the financial challenges that some families are experiencing, it seems like they've been infused with steroids. Their finances are no longer a challenge, they're an outright disaster. So what do you do when money is tight and times are tough? I love that the Bible is such a practical book that it addresses so many of the issues that we face in life. In the area of finances, the Bible's been described as the best book ever written on financial management. There is a great amount of very wise counsel in the pages of Scripture regarding finances and money management. And while my wife and I certainly have not lived out every financial principle of the Bible perfectly, we have attempted to manage our finances in light of biblical principles. I remember when we first did the Dave Ramsey course on financial peace, and I believe that course has been taught here at FCC previous to my coming. As he taught, I could never have imagined at that point having 6 months of emergency savings in a savings account. And I could certainly never imagine actually being debt-free, which those are two of the goals that Dave Ramsey challenges in this Financial Peace University. But 20 years after first taking the course and subsequently teaching the course several times, this is financially where we are at. Now, if you're visiting here at First Christian Church today for the very first time, lucky you. Today is the Sunday that I give my sermon on money. Now, certainly for many, it's an uncomfortable topic. But I want to assure you, it's been probably 3 years here since I have last spoken directly on this topic. And while I understand many folks don't like hearing sermons about money because, all the church ever does is talk about money, I look forward to speaking on this topic because I know the teachings on finances found in the Bible work, and they work well. About 3 to 4 years into our marriage, I allowed us, and I say I, because Susie really wasn't aware that this was happening. I allowed us to get way in over our heads financially with credit cards. Because I was a young minister and I wasn't paid well by my first church, I saw credit cards as a way to supplement my lack of income. Well, it didn't take very long for that plan to blow up in my face. One day, I remember I was attempting to pay some bills, and I knew I wasn't going to have enough to cover it all. And so in frustration, I was just venting verbally within the range of my wife's listening ears. And finally, she said to me, "Well, what do you want me to do?" I didn't really have an answer. So in my youthful 20-something naivety, I blurted out, well, maybe you could at least worry about this with me. To which she correctly responded, you worry enough for both of us. Well, soon after this incident, we sat down with a financial advisor who was a committed Christian person. He shared with us what the Bible taught about money management. And we committed to getting our finances in order using this biblical plan. Progress was slow. Things didn't turn around for us overnight or even over a year. But over a period of time, with a lot of patience and diligence, our financial situation began improving. We were able to pay off the debt that I had led us into. And we were also able to save enough money for a down payment to buy our first home. We've practiced those principles ever since, and it has led to where we are today. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2 says this, now a person who is put in charge as a manager must be faithful. It is the Lord himself who will examine me and decide. Now, this sounds very much like the message we shared last week about the parable of the talents and how the manager or the owner gave these three men money to manage. And it was the owner himself that examined what they gave and decided whether they had handled it faithfully or not. And so we learned last week, if you were with us, that we're not the owners of what we possess. We are managers. That's all. And God will hold us responsible for how we manage all that he has put us in charge of. So today I'd like to give you a few biblical insights on managing finances. For, listen, many of us, money is tight, and we are all living in tough times. So what I want to do for you is lay out a plan that if you could implement and execute over a period of time, this will work, because it's worked for Susie and I. If, as the Bible says, you don't grow weary in doing well, you will reap benefits as you are faithful to these principles over the long haul. Now, the Bible's teaching on money management is fairly straightforward. It's not rocket science. And it all begins, I think, with this first principle, and that is to save well. Save well. Now, it might surprise you to learn that the Bible speaks often of the importance of saving money. Many of you are familiar with the history and the story of Joseph of the Old Testament, who after a series of tragic setbacks eventually becomes second in command in all of Egypt. And in this position, Joseph advises his boss, the Pharaoh of Egypt, to store up 20% of their gross national product during the prosperous years, so when lean years come, the nation would have ample resources and supplies to get through the tough times. We read in Genesis chapter 41, verses 33 through 36. Pharaoh should find, this is Joseph and his advice to Pharaoh, Pharaoh should find intelligent and wise men to be supervisors over the land, and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead, and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it, so there will be enough to eat when the years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. You know, truthfully, I wish we had such wise and intelligent people leading our country today. Maybe we wouldn't have a debt of over $1 trillion. Well, Joseph teaches us to be disciplined enough to save, especially during the times and the years of prosperity. And his savings plan is really pretty aggressive. 20% of all income is to be saved during times of prosperity. Remember back in 1990, the average American family in 1990 was saving 10.9% of their income. In 2008, though, just before the recession hit and the housing crisis hit, it was down to less than 1%. Now, if you remember anything, the 90s and the early part of this century were very prosperous years here in the United States. People were making money, investments were doing well, everything was strong. But what Americans were doing is they were spending all of this prosperity. They weren't saving it, as evidenced by the fact that the average savings went from 11% to less than 1% in all of these years of prosperity that our country was experiencing. Now, it's a bit better today. Not that great. Today, the average American family saves about 4.4% of their income. That's still a far cry from what financial experts and the Bible say we should be saving to plan properly for things like emergencies and retirement. I like Proverbs chapter 21, verse 20. In the Living Bible, it says this: "The wise man saves for the future, but the foolish man spends whatever he gets." And so if you want to be a wise person, you're going to save. If you want to be foolish, you're going to spend all that you get. Now, what that means is this: you've got to live on less than you make. That's simple. You live on less than you make. You don't buy the biggest house, even though the realtor and the mortgage lender will tell you that you can afford way more than this house you're looking at. You don't drive the most expensive car that you can finance. You don't buy new furniture or take vacations on credit anticipating that somehow you will pay this all off over time. Now, you practice discipline. You practice being frugal with your finances so that you have money left over at the end of the month. Now, of course, there is a warning in the Bible regarding saving too much. It's called hoarding money, and there are warnings about that. Some folks, and maybe some of you are like this, I don't know, are so obsessed with savings that they don't provide properly for their family, or they won't use any of their abundance to bless other people. Jesus shared an entire parable about the dangers of a person and a man who just kept building bigger and bigger barns to store all of his prosperity. He refused to use any of it to care for those in need. Jesus commanded that it all be taken from him. And so you can take this principle and this teaching to save well, but you could certainly take it to an extreme point where God doesn't want you to go. Proverbs 6 says this: take a lesson from the ants. Just think about it. Take a lesson from the ants. The only lesson I can think of taking from an ant is just get out of the way when you see a stomping foot coming at you, right? But it says, learn from their ways and become wise. An ant is wise. Listen, this is why they're wise. They labor hard all summer gathering food for the winter. They're wise because they save. They're wise because they plan. They're wise because they're prepared. And so if you want to be financially sound, yet you want to be graciously generous, you need to make it your goal, I think, to save between 10 and 20% of your income. If you're saving less than 10%, you're going to be in trouble when the lean times arrive. If you're saving more than 20%, you may be getting in the danger of storing up your treasures and not using them for what God has blessed you with for his purposes. But the Bible generally points to this 10 to 20% range for savings. Most financial advisors suggest that our total savings rate be about 20% of our income. Now, of course, to be able to save this range, some of you may say, there is no way I could save. I wish I could save 20% of my income. That's not happening. And that's because we're not doing the second principle. We're not implementing the second biblical principle for money management, and that is this: manage well. If you're going to save well, you've got to be able to manage well. Jesus said this in the Gospel of Luke. He said, "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish it, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" Now, we've got this stage construction project going on here. And it may not look like a lot was done this past week, but in fact a lot was, because all the wiring, the guts and all were installed this week and should be floored this coming week. But what would happen if we had to tell those who are doing the work, "You've got to stop the work, we've run out of money. And for the next 3, 4, 5 months, you guys keep here, and all you see is this." And finally somebody says, "Are you ever going to finish that?" And we say, "Well, we got started, but we didn't realize how much it was going to cost, and so we ran out of money, so we can't finish the project." Well, that wouldn't say much about our ability to lead and manage properly, would it? See, Jesus is all for planning. He's all for managing well. The Bible writers speak extensively about the need to plan and manage well. Now, I could spend multiple weeks teaching on money management. I enjoy to do that because, again, I know these principles work. But I just want to share a few principles here in the next few minutes. I'm not going to be able to do justice to this topic, no doubt, but I want to hit a few highlights of what it means to manage our finances, our money, well. The first thing, if you're going to manage well, you've got to commit to living on and within a budget. Living on and within a budget. Now, this sounds simple enough, obvious enough, but you'd be surprised how many families attempt to get by financially without having a clue of how much their expenses are versus how much their income actually is. And you've heard the statement, failing to plan is a plan to fail. And so if you're not living on a budget, that's just a plan to fail. And the key to a good budget, again, it's very simple. Limit your spending to what your budget can allow. And that's going to take some work to add up, to do the work, put the work in to make sure that your expenses, your living expenses, is not exceeding what your income is. See, families get in financial trouble when they overextend themselves on homes or vacations or cars or recreation, when they don't first make sure that they can afford these things. They don't count the cost, as Jesus said. I mean, I certainly could live in a much bigger house than I do. I could drive a nice pickup truck, a really nice one, by probably Tuesday I could have it in my driveway. I could go on some really, really expensive vacation. I can go out and buy an RV or a boat. There will always be somebody who'll be willing to lend me to do all of this. And I could do all of this if I'm willing to take on debt and monthly payments or deplete our savings. I could have all of these things. But I'm not willing to take on debt and deplete our savings. See, the key to financial security is really pretty simple. Spend less than you make. And for most of us, this is doable. Now, I realize in some cases, income levels are so low. Maybe you're a widow or widower and you're on a really, really fixed budget, and I get that. You know, and it could be, or you may have a job that just doesn't pay enough, and you can't live on such a small income. I understand that. I mean, you might have to get training to do a job that pays better, or you might have to take an extra job on. But for most people, living within a budget is doable. And I know how I can prove this. There are many people in our country who live on less than what I make. And so if they're able to live on less than what I make, I should be able to live on less than what I make. And if you say, I just don't see how I could live on less than I make, just understand there are people in this world, a lot of people who live on less than what you make. And they're living on less than what you make. So yes, you can do that if you decide that's what you're going to do. Now, the advice I've often given as I've taught through Financial Peace University is this. I call it the 80 or the 90-80 rule. And that is this: live on 90% of 80% of your income. You live on 90% of 80% of your income. So that means you got to figure out what your income is. And you got to take 80% of that. And then you got to take 90% of that number. Let me give you an example how this works. And it says the 89-90 rule. That should be the 80-90 rule. I guess I hit the 9 instead of the 0 when I was making the slides. But the 80-90 rule. Let's say you have an income of $4,000 a month. You times that by 80%, and that's $3,200. You take that $3,200 and you times that by 90%, and that comes to $2,880. That's your limit. You take on nothing that would push your expenses beyond $2,880 a month. Now, if you say, well, I already have the car payment, I already have the house payment, I already have this and that, well, you got to start selling stuff. You got to start making some adjustments, some changes, and at least make it your goal at some point over the next 5 or so years that you can get to that number. It takes discipline, and it takes priorities. And the first thing you have to get into your mind is, yes, you can live on 90% of 80% of your income. Why do I say 90% of 80%? Because you're going to see 10%, at least 10% savings, 10% to God. That leaves you 80%. You don't want to budget all of that. I mean, you've got to leave some freedom, some flexibility within that budget. So that's why I say 90% of 80% of your income. And again, that may require some changes. It's certainly going to take some time to get there, but you can do it with enough planning, enough discipline, and enough time. And so you got to live on and within a budget. Second thing you've got to do is you've got to build an emergency fund. You've got to build an emergency fund. Dave Ramsey's big on this. Says the first thing you got to do to get out of your mess is you got to figure out a way to get $1,000 in your savings account. Do you realize that, and I was listening to this, that like over half Americans don't even have $400 in an emergency savings account. And just like Joseph did in the Old Testament, financial experts say you need to set aside roughly 6 months worth of living expenses in an emergency fund. Where's that going to come from? Well, if you're budgeting and you get that budget under control, it's going to come from that 20% of your budget that you're not using to live day to day. This money should be kept in a safe investment. Be careful of the get-rich-quick schemes. You know, Paul told Timothy, listen, if those who want to get rich quick, they're going to do things that are unethical and immoral and illegal. So, you want to make sure that you're saving this in a safe investment, someplace that it's holding its value so your money is there to draw on when you happen to need it. And once you achieve that goal, first you save $1,000, you sell things, you do whatever you got to do to get that $1,000 into a savings account, and you build it up from there. And once you get that, well, then you're in a position where you could save up for large purchases. Or, if you're not there yet, you can, of course, save for retirement. But it begins with building an emergency fund. But you can't do that if you're not budgeting well. And so if you're going to manage well, you've got to live on a budget. You've got to build up an emergency savings. And number 3, you've got to avoid debt. Avoid debt. With interest rates rising, debt is way more expensive than it's been in a while. I heard on ABC News this week that the average American family now carries more than $5,000 in credit card debt. I recall when we were teaching this financial peace class at the previous ministry I had, One family was coming, this couple was coming, and they were driving. I mean, they lived in Queens in New York City, and they were driving out to Long Island where I was, and it was a good 45-minute drive one way for them to attend this class. So I knew they were really interested in this class and what we were teaching. One day I could tell that the gentleman wanted to speak with me one-on-one, and so after the class we kind of started talking a little bit privately, and he was sharing with me a little bit about his financial challenges. And so I asked him, I said, well, what do you have in credit card debt? And he said, oh, it's not really that much, because I'm thinking maybe it's your credit card debt that's got you in this position you're in. And so he didn't really know how much they had, and so he called his wife over and said, honey, come over here. He goes, how much do we have total in credit card debt? And she just started kind of thinking, and it took her a while to count this up, and I thought, this is going to be, if it's taking this long to figure this out, this is going to come up with it. And she goes, I think it's like between 40 and 45,000. And I immediately said to myself, this is what's wrong, that you don't think that this is a problem. Because he said, it's not that much. If you don't think that's that much, that's the problem. Proverbs 22:7 says this, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a slave to the lender. I don't want to be a slave to lenders. And debt isn't just bad money management. High levels of debt are associated with anxiety and depression and relationship problems, which are running rampant in our country. Yeah, most marriages fail, and the number one problem is finances. Debt can also be linked to high blood pressure, to lowered immunity, and a host of other physical symptoms, including headaches and back pain and ulcers. We very, very careful and very cautious during the pandemic. A lot of us wore masks. A lot of us got the vaccine. We worked. We kept our distances in big crowds because we wanted to prevent getting this virus. We need to work just as hard to prevent getting this virus of debt. My oldest sister didn't get married until she was 50. So she had to practice good financial management because she was a single lady living on a government salary in Washington, D.C., which is an expensive place to live. I recall her saying something once to my daughter. My daughter had commented on Facebook, and my daughter at that time was 30 years old. She was driving the same car that I had bought her when she was a junior in high school. And so I was kind of, proud of me. This girl had been driving this car for 12, 13 years. And so she was getting ready to turn 30, and she just posted on Facebook, hey, I'm turning 30 years old. I've driven the same car that I've been driving since I was in 11th grade. Man, I guess I deserve to have a new car. And my sister responded and said to her, and I'll never forget this, she said, if you can't afford to pay cash for it, you don't deserve it. And that's really good advice. Now, I'm glad to tell you, both of my daughters and their families are fine financially today because they learned the lesson of avoiding debt. My older daughter, who will now be 38 in November, has driven just 2 cars since she graduated from high school some 20 years ago. She was mentioning to me yesterday, she goes, my car is going to be 10 years old and Todd's truck's going to be 20 years old this year. They could afford, at least somebody will lend them the money to go get a new car. Same thing with my younger daughter. She's been driving the second car she's had since she graduated high school, and she's 34. They both my daughters and their families live in houses that are well below what some would suggest that they could purchase at their family's income levels. I'm proud to say that neither of my daughters have ever had to come to my wife and I and ask for financial help as adults because they have managed well and they have avoided debt. In fact, my daughter's at the point now where they're kind of at times very generous toward Susie and I. And we don't like taking money from our kids, but they at times want to bless us with what they have because they've learned to manage it well. And so this can be done. It took Susie and I almost 5 years to get out of the debt that I allowed to build up in our 20s, but we did it. And then we saved up for a down payment on our first home. We have never gotten back into debt since, and it's a great feeling. And so you need to save well and you need to manage well. But the third principle, biblical principle of financial management, and that is this: give well. Give well. You knew that was coming, right? You know, throughout the Bible, we are taught that everybody is supposed to give something. Those who lived under the Old Testament law were not to come to worship God empty-handed. Their offering was to be an act of sacrifice and of worship. And the same principle is taught in the New Testament. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul is praising this group of churches in Macedonia, which is a part of Greece. And he writes this: there had been this famine in Jerusalem, and the churches in Jerusalem were really, really struggling because of this famine. And so apparently the churches in Macedonia took up a collection, kind of like a love offering. And they collected all this money, and they gave it to Paul to take to the brothers and sisters they didn't know who lived thousands of miles away in Jerusalem. And this is what Paul writes about the Macedonians. He says, out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy, and their extreme poverty. So get this, these people are in a severe trial of their own, and they are experiencing extreme poverty. But because of their overflowing joy for God and His grace and His mercy and His love, this just welled up, Paul says, in rich generosity. For I testify they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. See, they didn't use the excuse, well, we are in an extreme trial and overwhelming poverty, we can't give. No, their attitude was, man, we are just so filled with joy that God has saved us, that God gave us Jesus, that He loves us, and He's been gracious to us. Man, how can we help those brothers and sisters in Jerusalem? So God commands every believer to develop this habit of being able to give of whatever resources that you have. And when money is tight, when times are tough, we're tempted to find excuses not to give. But tough times are not an excuse to back off from our giving. God expects everybody to give something, even those going through hard times. See, when you give, God promises to supply your needs, especially during tough times. God promises that if we trust Him enough to give to Him first, then He will supply all of our needs. He says that in Philippians 4, verse 19. And my God will meet all of your needs according to His glorious riches in Christ Jesus. Now notice, who's rich? God. Well, we just need to have what our needs are. We get those met, we should be good with that. God will supply your need. Now, maybe He's going to provide your need by what I like to call prevention. When the Israelites traveled through the desert and they put God first, the shoes of the Israelites in the wilderness did not wear out. God just prevented their shoes from wearing out so that they wouldn't have to buy new shoes. Think about that. If you give to God sacrificially, maybe like your refrigerator won't break. God will just keep that from breaking. Or maybe He's going to bless you because your car just manages to keep going. Or He keeps your roof from leaking. Or your kid's scholarship is renewed. Maybe God is going to supply your need through the generosity of other people. Maybe somebody offers to take you out to eat. Maybe somebody gives you clothing that their children have outgrown. Or somebody gives you a gift card. It's that time when you think that you're down to your last dollar that something happens and God comes through. And so God expects everybody to give something. And when you do, God promises He'll supply your needs. So, here comes the question, how much should we be giving? I think to answer that question, we need to consider the history of the Bible in three phases, or phases, not phrases, three phases. And we'll be quick on this. The first phase of history I want you to consider for this topic is the Pre-Mosaic Period. That is the period that Genesis covers, well before God gave Moses the Ten Commandments, along with the rest of the law that would govern his people for 2,000 years. That's known as the Pre-Mosaic Period. And from Genesis chapter 4, when Cain and Abel present gifts to God, to Genesis 14, when Abraham gives the high priest Melchizedek a tenth of everything he owned, to Genesis 28, where Jacob promises to give God a full tenth, the clear practice before the period of the Mosaic law was to give at least 10% back to God. And so this requirement of a tithe, it was being practiced before the Mosaic law was ever given. Then the second period of history is the period of the Mosaic law, when the law of Moses governed the people. You come to that time in history, it is clear that the tithe, and the tithe is the first 10% of our income, is God's standard for giving. In fact, they understood the tithe doesn't even belong to the giver, it belongs to God. God's people were not even to think of the tithe as theirs to do with as they pleased. It was the Lord's, and they were to automatically give it back to him. So much so that when people failed to give back the first 10% to God, God accuses his people of robbing him by failing to tithe. And so tithing is seen as really a test of faith. So when people fail to tithe, they fail to give God back that first 10%, they fail to show faith and trust in God. Listen, God doesn't need your 10%. He is rich. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. God is saying, I want to test you and you want to test me. And so when we fail to put God first, when we say, God, I can't do this, there is no way I'm going to be able to give 10%. We're not showing the faith and the trust in God that he wants us to. And so it's not a matter of, well, I don't give. It's a matter of, well, I don't have faith in God enough to supply all of my needs from his glorious riches. I don't trust God enough to do what he says he's going to do in his word. See, when we're committed to giving 10% and saving at least 10%, you know what that does? It forces us to trust God that he is going to stretch that 80% that's left over further than we can stretch the 100%. Say that again. It forces us to trust God that he's able to stretch that 80% further than we can stretch 100%. And I think this is why God treats the lack of tithing as contemptible. Because the failure to tithe is a failure to trust God in faith. And so, prior to Moses, the Mosaic law, during the Mosaic law, the tithe was it. Well, what about the Christian age? I've often heard it said, well, tithing was an Old Testament law. We're under grace now, and the New Testament doesn't command us to give a tithe. It just commands that we be generous in our giving. Okay, I don't argue with that. But if the tithe was expected during the Pre-Mosaic period and the Mosaic period, how much more should we be giving that we are in the Christian age, where we are full recipients of God's mercy, God's grace, and God's love? And Jesus did, in fact, instruct us to tithe, to give that first 10%. In Matthew chapter 23, he's talking to religious leaders. For he says to them, for you are careful to tithe even to the tiniest income of your gardens. Yes, you should tithe. Now, the Greek word that is translated there, for you're careful to tithe, that word is a Greek word, small Greek word, D-E-A. We would pronounce it day. And it's a strong word. It indicates a necessity. A necessity. You should, you must, this is like a command. You need to do this. So Jesus upholds the tithe as the level by which God's people should be giving. And while the rest of the New Testament does not explicitly repeat the command to tithe, I believe the biblical command to tithe extends to those of us living under grace in the Christian age. And I also believe the baseline of 10%, as expressed in the Old Testament, is the minimum amount that God expects us to give to him through his church. And so the tithe, giving that first 10%, it is essential to our obedience, to our faith, and to our trust in God. It is vital for the ongoing work of Christ's church, and I believe it is required to receive God's blessings. And so when people have said to me, I can't afford to tithe, I've always told them, you can't afford not to tithe. Why? Because I believe God will stretch that 90%, that 80%, a lot further than you could stretch that 100%. So if you think, wow, I don't know that I could do this, just think of the blessings you're missing out on because you're not doing this. See, in an age when studies tell us that evangelical Christians give less than 3% of their income to the church or to any ministry, I want to encourage you to accept God's challenge and to commit to the biblical tithe. God doesn't promise that he's going to make you rich, but he will provide for your needs and pour out blessings on you. And as the old saying goes, you cannot outgive God. Well, we learned last week when we looked at the parable of the talents that our master is away, but he will one day return, and on that day, he will ask us to account for everything he has given to us to manage for him, including our finances. And if we save well and we manage well and we give well, we can expect to hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. Right now, as we wrap this up, we have two opportunities here at First Christian Church to be generous beyond our regular tithes and contributions to our church. We are raising funds right now, both for school supplies and to provide shoes for students in Mims Elementary and in Pinewood Elementary. I was at a meeting on Wednesday with the principal at Pinewood Elementary, Mrs. Robinson, and she was telling me that well over half of the kids in her school are in what's considered crisis mode, meaning that their parents do not, cannot, will not provide school supplies or shoes for their kids. And so we're going to step in there and we're going to sponsor these two schools, Mims and Pinewood. And so we are collecting school supplies. There are bins out there. There's also a place if you want to get gift cards to Rack Room Shoes. It's over in Titus Landing. Or you can put a donation in there and we'll buy those gift cards. But we're looking to do that. And of course, the second opportunity right now is we are raising funds for Kenny and Charlotte Bennett. As you know, Kenny had a massive stroke on the 4th of July. He is making phenomenal progress, but he's got a long way to go. He's in rehab up in Ormond Beach. His wife is traveling back and forth. Eventually, she's going to have to rent a short-term place up there. And so they've got expenses that they were not, again, they're prepared for because they're good financial planners, but we need to jump in and help there as well. So those are two opportunities that you can be generous and you could put everything that I've kind of taught today into practice. So I hope that this helps you. I know that it has helped me. We're running a little late, so we're going to pray, and then we're going to watch the announcement video. I'm going to watch the announcement video, and then we'll be able to be dismissed. So let's pray. God, thank you for this opportunity to hear from your word and take in what your word has to teach us. God, I pray that you'll just bless us now, God, and you'll just flood us, God, with your blessings as we trust you. And we pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Let's go ahead and run the announcement.